Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is a session on social justice and LEED, two very exciting topics. You don't have to read this, it's just a requirement. Here are the learning objectives. Here's who we are. My name is Karen Robichaud. I'm the Director of Creative Engagement at Payette, so I'm not an architect and I don't even play one on TV. What I care about is social equity and social justice. I come from a theater and marketing background, and I joined up with these two guys to talk about this exciting stuff.
Hi, I'm Brad Guy. I'm a member of the USGBC LEED Social Equity Pilot Credit Working Group. That's a long name. And you're going to hear more about that. I also teach ethics and stewardship in the Sustainable Design program at Catholic University. And I wanted to say, why am I here? As a child, I lived in Morocco. And in Morocco, white people are the minority. And in Morocco, there are other people besides what I knew as a child in the United States that profoundly affected me for the rest of my life. And I know that's a personal story, but I think we all have to find what is personal and what's meaningful to us about these issues if we're going to be committed to them.
Great. So my name is Sean Hesse. I'm on staff with the International Living Future Institute, and I'm also on the Social Equity Working Group with Brad. Another shout. There's additional people from the Social Equity Working Group, if you haven't figured that out. And I just wanted to point out and kind of acknowledge that we lucked into gender diversity on this panel. Brad and I put in a proposal, and we were looking at one another going, how are we going to stand up on a stage and talk about, the work that we're trying to talk about? And luckily, Karen reached out to me and said, hey, you want to maybe put together a session on social justice and green build? And I went, yes. We kind of lucked into gender diversity. We obviously haven't figured out how to luck into racial diversity. And so I think one of the things that is important for us to acknowledge is that even when we have really good intentions, we can't just luck into this stuff, right? It only comes if we are conscious about it and are working on it. And even then, we're still not living up to what we want to be doing. So anyway.
And part of our charge today is that we're asking you to commit. So we're going to talk a lot about what can we do as individuals, firms, on our projects. And I have at the bottom of these slides a hashtag, Lead with Equity. And what we challenge you to do today is share some of the stuff you hear. If you hear something great that you want to remember, we want to make this an ongoing dialogue so that people who aren't in the room today can come back to it. They know who was here. And at the end, we're going to ask you to think about one thing that you can do, that you can commit to in your work. And you have pieces of paper, you can write it down, hold it up, take a selfie, and we want you to share it because we want to be able to show that this is a group of people who are committed to change. So we're going to talk about a bunch of different stuff, including...
So let's have a show of hands. Do you know there are credits in LEED for social equity? Who knows that? Awesome,
yes.
Thank you. Maybe tell 2 other people that when you leave, please. And there are 3 credits, which we will go into in more detail. And this, to acknowledge the efforts of USGBC, this is part of the mission of USGBC. Several years ago, Heather Rosenberg and Joel and Todd put together an assessment about social equity in the built environment that helped move this forward and laid the foundation for this work. So please spread the word.
So I want to get us started by defining a couple of key terms. We all have biases. It is a human thing. When you are in the woods and you see a snake, you have a bias against that snake and you run away. That's a good instinct. But some of our biases don't lead us to have good instincts in our work. We need to overcome them. And a lot of them are things we're not aware of. They're deep hidden in the recesses of our minds. And so part of what we want to help you think about today is how can you start to undo some of that? How can you create a consciousness where you don't typically have it? And the downside to a lot of these biases is that they tend to be negative or cause negative outcomes. There's implicit bias, which is what's unconscious, but then there's also things like confirmation bias. I want this idea to be good, and so I'm looking for the ways for it to be good. Or even the availability bias. If something's just there and you're like, yes, that, but that doesn't necessarily mean you've done all the work. And a lot of what we're asking you to do today is to slow down a little bit and create more checkpoints, which can take more time, but ultimately leads to these better outcomes. The other thing that's in play a lot is our stereotypes. They're fast shortcuts for us. The downside of stereotypes is although they have a nut of truth in them often, they are never complete. And so we're often missing the full picture, and it means that we miss out on talent or other opportunities. So, equality versus equity. Equality assumes that we all need the same baseline. Equity acknowledges that some people are working at different deficits. So here, what we're saying is equality says everybody gets an apple box, whether they need it or not, whether they can see over the fence. Equity is saying maybe some people need two. And so what are those different things you can build into your processes? And part of our challenge as a group that comes from a design discipline, how can you design around some of these things? So in some cases, you might say, well, can we remove the fence? Is that one way to design a solution? So here's a really simple design example. A gentleman had adopted children from other countries. He was white, they were not. And his kids said, how come there's no Band-Aids that's my skin color? So he developed a line of Band-Aids that's for every skin tone. Really simple, but it sets the precedent for you are included. This is for everyone, not just what I think is for everyone. Similarly, if you think about emojis on your phone, lots of ways to communicate humor or different ideas. A lot of the folks designing emojis were designing from their own perspective, so they didn't include multiple races. And now they've come out with emojis that are gender neutral, that show different ages. Again, what are the different ways that we can include the broad spectrum?
So the way that we've been thinking about this stuff in the relationship to what we're going to be doing in the breakouts as we move through this is to break these down into kind of a taxonomy of 3 different ways that social justice can be manifest in our work as shapers of the built environment. So it's kind of what we see, who we hear, and what we say. In other words, what do we see in our firms? Who is it that we're hearing in the process of doing design or doing construction? And what are we saying through our actions, through the physical projects that we end up producing or the products that we end up selecting? So keep these 3 things in mind, right? In the firm, through our process, and in the project, because then when we do the breakout groups, we'll be using those 3 lenses consistently throughout the rest of the workshop. So just to give some context and a little bit of examples, what we see in our firms in terms of its own, our own diversity, our own gender balance, our own ethnic diversity. Programs like the JUST program, which is a social justice transparency label from ILFI that looks at worker benefits, gender and ethnic diversity within organizations, pay scale balance, et cetera. What we see when we literally produce our drawings, right? Are we using scale figures in our drawings that are culturally appropriate, or are they all just pulled from the same library of images? There's several great resources. One called Just Not the Same, another one called Non-Scandinavia, another one called Cut Out Life. But they're all real pictures of people in real settings from all over the world. And then examples like, are we actually seeing the history that has shaped the context that we're working in? So are we paying attention to the fact that we might be working in a neighborhood, for example, of Boston that has been discriminated against throughout history by racial zoning policies, lending policies, redlining policies, et cetera? And are we seeing that when we take that job and start to take that on? In terms of how these things manifest in the process, the top image shows the risk that someone who works in construction in the United States, the percent likelihood that they will become disabled through an accident at work over the course of their construction career. The average for non-Latino construction workers is 75%, but for Latino construction workers is 90%. So there's differential impacts that happen across racial boundaries. So construction safety in the process, right? In terms of the actual design process, who did we engage in the conversation, right? How we actually working with community organizing groups and groups that are actually affected by the design decisions that we're making. And the bottom image is of a bike share, which, you know, everybody kind of assumes bike shares are these great tools of equity because, you know, it doesn't require purchasing a bike, right? They're very often placed in neighborhoods that are low income as a kind of idea that we have shared infrastructure. The downside is that 20% of the United States is considered unbanked, meaning they cannot get a credit card, meaning they cannot access that. So we have to pay attention to the things that, you know, who we're designing for and who's engaged in that process to make sure that the solutions that we put forth actually solve the problems that we think we're trying to solve. And then the last is in the physical projects that we create, right? The kinds of projects that we choose to take on, like border infrastructure or prison infrastructure instead of school infrastructure. Or something as you know, simple as how we label and design toilet rooms and do the signage for those. Or the materials that we select and the supply chain issues that we end up reinforcing through the selection of those materials.
This is fun, right? So this is from the AI Women's Leadership Summit this fall. So it's a summit for women. 400 women attend, and there are some men, like AI staff and a couple of journalists and that kind of thing. And it was at a hotel in DC, and so they converted the men's room on that level into a women's room. And they signaled that by putting ferns in the urinals. Because you have 400 women using those restrooms all day. What a ridiculous flow to say, oh, no, those 20 stalls, they are not for you, even though you're the only ones here. So there are really small and sometimes temporary things we can do to change how it feels. Is it a welcoming space for everyone? Is this a way to design all gender restrooms? Do you even need urinals? I don't think you use one at home. So think about that. I mean, how can you disrupt this? This is part of what we're going to ask you to do later. I mean, I also want to share this example, which I think many people are familiar with. U.S. orchestras in the 70s, only 5% of them were women. And it wasn't that suddenly women became better musicians. It's that symphonies realized that there was a bias in play. And so they actually started to do blind auditions. And they even realized that they needed to also either ask the musicians to take their shoes off or to ask them to walk on carpeting, because you can hear shoes on hardwood, and sometimes that will even trigger you, whether you mean to or not, to say, oh, that's a woman, that's a man. And so, you know, I like this example because art and design are things that we think we have taste, we know that it's good, but that doesn't mean that we've still erased all these things that are ingrained in us. And so what are those different things? Whether it's, you know, in your firm, how you practice, do you do blind resume review or introduce other things into that hiring or partnering process to erase some of those biases? And this is important because seeing is believing. The more we see it, the more it becomes real. The more you have a Band-Aid that is your skin color, the more you're like, yeah, of course, I'm just a person who uses Band-Aids. It doesn't really say anything or other me. And so this is from Iris Bonet's book. She is from the Harvard Kennedy School. She wrote a book about designing around gender equality. And she talked about how who you put on the walls matters. Who you look up to matters. When you're walking into an interview and everything that is held up on the wall is by people who are not like you, what does that say? Do you have a chance? How many things do you have to overcome?
Is this the advance here?
The green arrow.
Okay. Thanks, Karen.
You're welcome.
So I'm just going to go through the pilot credits a little bit so we have a little bit of knowledge about them. And the way I like to think about these pilot credits is they are a concentric circle. If we think about what we can influence most directly as a firm or a constructor or an investor owner outward. So what can you control today? You can do something in your own office or firm or hiring practice and so on. You have control in that sort of concentric circle idea. Outward from that, you have the community. So people who use your buildings. It may not be the owner. Owner is clearly a stakeholder, but who else is a stakeholder? Well, pretty much everyone who's going to experience that building from an urban context, also as an occupant and somebody it might serve, depends on what it is. And of course, the investments and so on that are made, so those ripple outward from that. And then perhaps the more difficult, is literally more difficult to grasp, is the materials that we use. So these might literally be the most furthest flung from our project. Materials from other countries, extracted from other countries, processed in other countries. We may only get the final product within your own area or site. What is that supply chain? What are the impacts of extraction processing on the people who do that work? Again, the investments and community relations. We can all look to something like Forest Stewardship Council as a model of both the environmental practices that go into that harvesting, but also the worker and social relationships. So in that idea, we start with social equity in the community, in developing a project and the programming and what can happen in that project. So this is the first credit in the series. One of the options to do it is called the SEED process. So this is social, economic, and environmental development. It's easy to remember, seed into LEED. And so this is an example of a project that actually has gotten the pilot credit, the Dahlia Campus for Health. This is in Colorado. So again, you might say, well, sure, it's got preschool, it's got community spaces, it's got kitchen. Inherently, this project, you can see that the programming is part of the community, it's a community space. But to make clear, that does not mean that there can't be a community aspect to any kind of project. Think about corporate, A-class office space. What can also be part of a community involvement? For pilot credit in the project team. So again, to note, we now have this credit available for EBOM and neighborhood development, existing building operation and maintenance and neighborhood development. So what is different there is highlighted in the red. So for operation and maintenance, you have an pre-existing building. So you're not necessarily having the same construction team, for example. No real major work in that regard might be happening. So who is the team? The team at this point now is the operators, the people who are actually maintaining the building, and what you can do as far as facilities managers or hiring those different contractors in that regard. And so here's an example in the project team. So as Sean mentioned, JUST is one of the options, one of the pathways. I urge you to look up the credits so you see that there's more than one way to achieve them. We had to start with some criteria, some established standards. As you know, LEED likes to use as many standards that exist as it can. But we'd also offer the option to develop your own process as long as you meet the criteria, the intent that we want you to have. So Brunner Cott is actually here in Boston, is a JUST certified firm.
Did anybody from Brunner Cott make it in? No.
Okay, so we need to tell Brunner Cott to.
Yeah, we can. Sorry, we can.
Use this for all
we
their
got to
credits.
speed ahead because we're cutting into our charrette
And then the
time.
last circle here is the supply chain. So I just want to point out, we do have these very fundamental principles. And just, you can look at those anytime you want, but these are the kind of fundamental human rights that we're talking about that we wish to serve and at base for all of these credits. And so manufacturers are adopting these credits now. This is just an example of the code of conduct for 2 manufacturers. So these would be enabled for the credit.
So
Okay.
we are going to have you guys think about some of this stuff. And we have structured a couple of activities. And how this is going to work is you're going to draft a LEED credit. Now, we have a little guide here on the side of what goes into that. Just do your best guess, but we're asking you to think about how different things intersect and how you might be able to influence change at different levels. So, what's going to happen is, over here, these 2 rows, raise your hands. Fabulous, you are red. So when you look up here, you're going to start with the firm lens, and you're thinking about what can a firm do as it intersects with gender, with some of the things we've talked about today. What are some solutions? And the 3 of us are going to circulate. These 2 rows? Yes. Okay, you are yellow, so you're going to be process and gender. And then over here, blue. Thank you. So you guys are going to start with project and gender. And what I'm going to do is after about 7 to 10 minutes, I'm going to raise my hand up here. So you're going to stop talking and you're going to look at me. And when you see me raise your hand, you're going to raise your hand. So you'll signal your neighbors to stop talking. And that means we're going to transition to the next one. And you're going to stay with your same color. Okay, so the color is the key. And we will circulate throughout this process so that we'll hear some of your cool ideas. And at the end, when we wrap up, we might have tapped one of you to share something that you're doing. And then more broadly, don't forget, share on social media some of the stuff you're thinking about today. Are you ready?
Are there any questions about this?
Yes. So are they going to introduce themselves by saying an idea?
So after you draft your idea, you're going to use it to introduce yourself to your table.
So, and the idea behind the exercise is that by framing it as developing it as a LEED credit, what it means is it's forcing you to think about it as something that you can do, something that's actionable that you can do that will address gender inequity in our firm, in our process, or in our projects. So.
And can I add, don't worry if you can't come up with a third-party certification for what you do, okay? Just whatever you think the step or action can be. We'll worry about the credit language and reality later.
Okay. Yes? Anything that you are inspired by. It will just fuel your discussion. Okay? Are you ready? That was lame. Are you ready? Thank you.
Go.
So do we want to...
Thank you. That was excellent. Okay. So I hope this started to get the juices flowing. I know it's open-ended. I heard some confusion, but we really just want to help you be prompted to think about some of these things. So our next task is to think about poverty. And again, same prompts. You're staying in the same group. So if you were yellow, now you're project. If you were red, your project.
Process.
And over here, process. And over here, your firm. Okay? Thank you. Okay, I started to hear some more juices flowing, some interesting ideas that I think we're going to hear back at the end. Our final lens is race. And again, same intersections. So now, project, firm, process. Okay? And you're going to have 7 more minutes, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes to share back a little bit. We might tap 1 or 2 of you, and for some questions.
It's not nearby. There's no puddle.
Okay, so it is now about 2:45. So I am going to bring it back and see if we have some things that folks want to share. Oh, that's just who we are. You don't need to see that again. Okay, so I heard some interesting things. I'm going to see if the person from Bank of America would be willing to share, because I heard some interesting things over there. Will you come to one of the microphones? And if you have any questions that you want us to address, please line up behind her so that we can answer some of your questions. Can you share some of the stuff you were talking about with process?
Sure. We were talking about it was in the poverty piece, and we were talking about how you can provide opportunity to folks equitably, potentially, and we talked about healthcare specifically, and at Bank of America, there's a sliding scale of folks who make less money, pay less proportionally for their healthcare than those who make more money. They pay a higher percentage. And so the idea is, how can you provide a process that will affect or potentially impact different populations in a different way to hopefully level the playing field somehow.
And thank you. I shared an example with them when I overheard them, because I attended a conference last year where I heard from someone from the 3% conference, which is focused on getting more women into creative director roles in advertising, because women represent 80% of the buying power in the US, but only 3% of creative directors were women, so that doesn't seem like a great match. And one of the things they've done is they created a list of 100 things allies can do to impact change. And I thought of this when these folks were talking, because one of the things they're doing is they're putting pressure on their clients. And so they're creating pressure points at different places in the process to say, you know, as a client, I won't work with a firm that doesn't consider these things. And so I'm wondering if there are other places in the process where you can say, you know what, we don't partner with that type of firm, or this one that doesn't think about poverty or race or gender from these different perspectives. So that's another place where you can create some tension there. Does anyone else want to share something that their group came to, something that changed for them? Are you all very shy?
You know, you came to a workshop that was an interactive workshop, right?
Yeah. Can you go to the microphone, because we are recording this, and so we want everyone to hear what you have to say.
But don't let that get in the way of you standing in front of the microphone.
On the issue of race and the firm, we talked about you can wait until candidates approach your office and then have a certain filter or lens that you, like you said, blind interviewing. Mm-hmm. But there's also an opportunity for firms to make a 5, 10, and 20-year commitment to reach into the educational programs that have diverse student bodies. So, for example, the Wentworth Institute locally has a tremendous commitment to students from around the world and from other backgrounds. And the firm could choose to mentor a young student from a diverse place and support them as someone who's new to this country and new to architecture, and look at the long view to help bring those young architects from diverse backgrounds into our country and potentially into your firm, that you could build a base for strong support for these people.
So following up on that on race, we talked about outreach and that it's not an accidental, it's not going to happen accidentally, it's got to be intentional. But the other thing that came up at the very end was it's not just about bringing people into the firm, it's about looking at yourself and sort of the implicit bias that you already have in the firm, and maybe that's part of the process, is addressing that at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other part about recruiting that I think about is if you look at your firm, you probably have a lot of people from particular university where you've developed deep roots, and so can you deepen those roots in other places? And again, that is part of that longer term payoff that you might not see a result in a year, but it's part of your 5 or 10-year plan that we want to deepen our roots at historically black colleges or other universities that draw from different populations. And then how does that change your design work and what kind of work you're doing?
Okay.
Oh yeah, we have another.
So I'm waiting for the list of 10 things personally, but so we took the LEED credit idea pretty literally, and I would say first that I think when we think about race and gender and poverty, it felt to us like the poverty, at least to me, that the poverty question is maybe the hardest one and the one I haven't thought about very much. Mm. The race and gender are things that were pretty normal to think about these days. But Laura at our table is part of a program in Los Angeles that trains the facility staff in buildings, in some of the buildings in Los Angeles. And one of the things they run into is that they just even don't have space for the people who are actually taking care of these buildings. They're eating their lunch in their car. And so a very LEED idea would be to have a space, just like we say, let's have space for recycling. Let's have a livable space for the people who actually manage and take care of and clean and do all these things in the building, and say that's something we want to do.
Thank you.
We were talking about the idea, as a planner, you have a lot of community meetings, and I think a dual kind of solution is to encourage kids to come to community meetings. I think one, it's good for them to learn about the process. They also maybe learn about careers that they never thought of. And a lot of times I think people don't attend community meetings because they say they don't have childcare, whereas if you bring the kids along, maybe they're part of the process. You have people who then automatically have childcare because you bring your kids along. And I just think it's a way to kind of bring a community together more holistically, is to bring the kids along. So,
Thank you.
Hey.
Hi.
We chatted about the poverty thing too quite a bit and felt like that was really hard. But one of the things I think we came to fairly quickly was that poverty is such a multifaceted really set of issues, and in any given place there's a different balance of those various issues. So we shied very much away from any kind of a prescriptive approach, to use LEED lingo, and started with seeking understanding. Like in a particular place, first you have to try to understand what the factors are there, and then think about how to respond to it.
Thank you. Oh, awesome. So at the beginning of the session, we gave you a call to action. We asked you to think about what you can commit to do. And part of our idea behind some of the 10 things was that you would generate them in this room today, because we want them to be actionable and manageable for you as individuals. And so we asked people to share what they're committed to. If you haven't shared yet, please do. This is some of what people are saying. We would love to have this be a place that we can go to after today and to keep talking about and see if there are seeds for those future pilot credits. Do either of you have anything you want to say before we ask for any more questions?
I mean, I want to hear what people were talking about.
Yeah.
Just go for it. How's that? Whatever background or situation, we experience these things in our lives as maybe not necessarily the recipient of injustice, because we're all able to come to Greenville. But we always have a part in that, maybe to recognize our roles, as Sean mentioned.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Does anyone else want to share about something that they talked about in their group at any point during this afternoon? Wow, y'all are really shy. Do you have any questions for us?
What didn't make sense?
Is there a way to contribute other than on Twitter?
Yeah, you can.
There's a microphone.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean later? Other than Twitter, you can email us for sure. Where's our
slide with our emails?
Yeah.
Can we pull the slides back up? Those are our email addresses. Yes.
So, in poverty, we were looking at the perspective of the firm through poverty, and we were talking about how there's really poverty among us that we're not aware of, and that oftentimes young employees or different employees at lower pay scales don't have enough money to really buy the clothes they need for a professional environment, and so somehow through the office making clothes or clothing allowances available. And also we did a survey through the students at the graduate school in architecture, and it's primarily a white student body. And they asked the question, did anybody here not eat in the last couple months because they didn't have the money? And 5 hands went up of white students. And so food, providing breakfast a couple times a week for your employees. We can't assume that everybody has enough money for, the most basic things. And then healthcare and contract workers. So.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we had talked about was if we make a specific LEED credit that addresses, gender and race and poverty levels, is the reality is that for my firm in particular, we try very hard to be diverse. But when every application that you get for employment is by a white male, and you go to the colleges and there's 150 white males and 4 women and 3 non-white people that are even in the classes. So what I would love to see happen is change the dialogue that we have with our kids at home, because everybody pushes for your kids to go to college, kids to go to college, kids to go to college. We still need people to build America. We still need people to build our projects. And trades make really good money depending on where you're at. You can work year-round. Is it physically hard? Yes. But you get good pay, you get benefits, and we need more women and we need more minorities in the trades. We're desperate for skilled workers, and you have to learn that skill, but we need to take those conversations and have those with our kids. For the kids that don't want to go to college and the parents think they've failed because their kids don't want to go to college, maybe they want to build. Maybe they want to make something. Let them.
Thank you. I just want to quickly add to that. I think one conversation that we had was about identifying the gaps. So if you're looking around your firm and you're saying, wow, we're a lot of men or we're really white, before assuming that women want to work for your company or assuming that people of a certain racial background want to work for your company, it's about engaging and bringing it back to the human level. And why would women want to work in your environment? Do you have a culture that is accepting to women? Are there roles that people of color can thrive in and be dynamic? So I think before making assumptions, it is about bringing it back to the human scale. Thank you.
Go ahead. I'm Colette, and I commit to change.
All right. I saw the tweets, and I just wanted to shout out to Megan, because this is what I wrote on my paper here for the gender LEED credit. This one's an easy metric, but make appliances and fixtures physically accessible to women. So reaching things in the bathroom. Hi. I liked your tweet.
Thank you.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. But, so my name's Mike with LISC in Boston, and I guess the one question that I would pose to everyone in the room is there are a lot of good ideas floating around at our table. We're talking about STEM scholarships, pro bono work that could be done on behalf of the community, and scholarships for trades and better apprenticeship programs, but I guess what I'm really wondering, beyond the credit level, is to really, are we interested in doing a scan of what firms are doing some of the best work in this space and using power of peer pressure on how we can collectively do better? Because it's not unique to Greenbelt. I think the planning profession is dealing with the same things, and the communities that LISC works in Boston, everyone cares about living wages. But there seems to be a disconnect of where are the workers, how can we hire more people? And I think the Legacy Project with Madison Park Technical High School is an example of trying to meet people where they are and engaging. But what does scaling that up look like? And I think it'd be really interesting if there are great programs, whether it's Detroit, California, Massachusetts. How do we learn about some of these better programs nationally and what firms are doing to lead the way to encourage greater inclusion from a race, diversity, and class perspective? So I'll just throw that out there.
Yeah. I'll shamelessly promote ILFI's Just program for that, which is a transparency platform for organizations that we can then use to celebrate the firms that are taking at least the first steps of looking. Like, how many people in this room actually know the gender diversity actual number of the organization that they work for? That's good. That's way more than I expected, actually. But a lot of people raised their hands that they knew about the pilot credits too, which also was very surprising. So maybe a self-selected crowd.
So we have one more person who wants to share something, and then we'll close it out.
I am here to ask a question. My name is Jasmine. I'm with Andelman and Lalick Engineering. We are a company of 9 people, which is why I know our gender ratio. But I know a lot of these issues are really important, so I'm glad we have a full room of people talking about them. And a lot of that might disproportionately affect certain communities that don't have access to new construction projects or might not be up for LEED certification in the first place. And I'm wondering what LEED and the USGBC community can do to reach these places and projects that aren't quite up for LEED certification but really need this type of improvement.
Well, I mean, I guess in response to that, I think one of the most important things is to make sure that when we think about doing outreach to communities or, kind of bringing green design to communities, it's really important that we look at the way that we're doing that and bring some humility to it and make sure that we're actually engaging people that we think we're designing for. So like the example of the bike share program, right? If we just look at it as like, oh, well, economically it's a shared resource, it's a bike lanes, it's a cheaper way of transportation, et cetera, without thinking about the fact that the problem isn't that there's no bike lane, right? The problem is that perhaps they don't have access to a credit card to even use the program. So I think the important thing is to make sure that when we are trying to do these kind of outreach programs that we actually engage people in the process to identify the problem in the first place so that we know that, and then you can actually start to co-create what the solutions are. And so I'm going to queue up Heather because she's going to respond to this, I think. Yeah.
It's really overwhelming when we think about doing what is community outreach, what is this community engagement thing, and one thing that's really often the case is that architects and certainly engineers don't get a lot of skills or training of how to talk to people, and particularly people who aren't like them, and how to do engagement. That's a whole skill set. And planners get more of it. And don't always do it well, but a lot of planners do a good job. But I think the key is finding partners. So who are the organizations that are working in the areas where you're working either near your firm or near your project that are really on the front lines of these issues, that are engaging in interesting ways or in any ways, and who themselves do some level of rigorous community engagement, not just local government. Local governments are required to do some level of community engagement. They may be a good portal to find who are the groups working in your area, and sometimes that just takes digging. But there are partners out there, and there are ways of working together, and sometimes that means bringing resources, so committing dollars to an engagement process, or to bringing somebody in who can speak about their own experiences with the community. And developing those partnerships over time. That all of these changes are not, we're going to pick, it's not like picking a product and plugging it in. It's actually about developing relationships. And so particularly at the firm level, but all the way through, committing to getting to know people, to building relationships, to developing trust year after year after year, so that you can bring people in and understand what they mean, and they can talk more openly and share their experiences.
Thank you. So we are just at our time. I want to share two more resources with you. One is the implicit association test, which will allow you to test your own biases on race, gender, ableism, all sorts of stuff I can't even remember. There are about 10 or 15. You can do them on your own on a computer, and you can actually see kind of where you map against other people. It's all anonymous, but they're collecting data in aggregate. And then the other is a short film called Sista in the Brotherhood, which is about women of color working in the trades. And with that, thank you for coming. Thank you for committing to change. I hope we'll continue this dialogue and have a great rest of your Greenbelt.